are the normal elements in the situation. They didn't mobilize against the mestizo. They didn't mobilize against, the Creollo, the whites, or the Yankees, right? What they organized is against the very mode of the state, right? The very exclusion of them from presentation.
This is sort of similar to what Paul does with their, again, constitutionally mandating that at their Congress be women.
Yeah.
The sort of notion that women aren't represented as such in the state until that happened.
Right. Is because the Maoists, as a singular force in Nepali politics, were able to overturn the mechanisms of counting. There's more to it than that. I believe that the Maoist revolution is itself an event, which we'll get into later, which means that it has certain generic procedures and procedures of forcing by which it has altered the situation simply by declaring itself revolutionary and Maoist. And by simply declaring itself, I mean, and also expressing fidelity, carrying out actions as though that were true. But yes, that's exactly right. It was a war against the state as a mode of representation, which in turn became a war against other elements in the situation, i.e. the comprador class, the capitalist class, etc. So does that cover?
I think it might also be worth pointing out that Badiou points out specifically that it is the intention of the state, both upper and lowercase, as to be extremely inclusive. There's no element that does exist that shouldn't be included. It's just that it doesn't belong necessarily.
Right.
So like the idea is like the Bolivian example, like all indigenous people will be counted. They will be included, but they're not included as belonging. Like they're not belonging to it as indigenous people. They belong to it as lower class farmers and whatnot.
Let me put it this way: they may belong to it as indigenous people, but they do so only as an indigenous class. For example, here in the United States, Native Americans are included in the state, but it's quite clear, right, that the way in which they are included is as a part that is to be administered.
Right.
It's not as though they belong to the state, right? That they.
Yeah, oddly enough, apparently, my right pointed out that the Bill of Rights isn't even applied to Native Americans at all, so it's just weird special inclusion.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the thing is they can be included, but they don't have to belong.
Right. I mean, and that would be, I think, the point of what Badiou is making, right? The state has to be inclusive. Like the whole purpose of having the state is so everything is included.
Right.
The void is included. It's rendered consistent. And it's no longer chaotic.
Right.
So everything must be included. I mean, of course, this has throwbacks to people like Foucault, right? There'll be infinite administrations and divisions and things like that. So that way you can be included, but not necessarily presented, right? Only represented.
Yeah. So I think that covers that for that. If you guys are all fine with that. Next is Spinoza, which I don't like Spinoza, so this was.
Want to tell us why you like Spinoza?
Well, I mean, this is basically Badiou's. I'm gonna just gloss over that unless anyone feels the urge to delve deeply into it. So basically, Badiou's position is that Spinoza's project is to have an not simply an all-inclusive, but an all-belonging multiple, and this multiple, of course, is going to be God, right? So what we have is we have the infinite modes of God belonging, or infinite modes, or all elements of existence belonging to this one multiple, which is substance or God or nature. So what Spinoza runs into is that then we frame this in the form of causality. And by causality, we know that through the elements presented to us, we also know that we can render a multiple consistent insofar as we know what causes them, i.e. what is the link between this multiple to the previous multiple. As we've been talking about, this runs into immense problems. For example, how is it that a finite individual, either myself or an object, can then render or can be generated out of an infinite substance, right? What is the process by which a finite thing becomes created out of the infinite? or that through a finite thing I come to know the infinite. And since there's no real method to do so, you just have to assert that it's through its infinite modes, right? So now everything has an infinite mode. Well, you run into the same problem of belonging and excess. If you assert the infinite belonging of, or that all things belong to a single substance, i.e. God, then where is the differentiation between the parts? And you lead to this sort of terminal excess in which you can no longer account for the infinity through the finite, and they have to essentially separate out into two distinct things. You have the finite, which continues to exist qua finite, but then you have a void between that finitude of the actual manifesting things and the infinite causality of the original substance, right? And the name of this void for Badiou becomes the infinite mode. And so he says, hey, look, this is what happens when you try to exclude the void as such, is it returns and renders your entire system inconsistent.
So basically, Badiou accuses Spinoza of failing to answer the question, why is there something instead of nothing?
No, actually, Badiou accuses.
Well, I think Spinoza's problem is the fact that he says, like, when he says, like, it's very rigorous monism, right? Everything is God. Everything that exists is God. There can be no vacuums or anything that limits. Because if there was something outside of substance, it would limit the totality of substance as such.
Right. Which of course clashes with the very notion of infinity, period.
Yeah.
Which is God is supposed to be the infinite substance.
Yeah, God is infinite substance. Well, so here's where the problem runs in then. It's on his monism. As a matter of fact, things are concretely manifested in a finite matter. The way in which he gets out of this contradiction is that, right, all things manifested have infinite modes, but the only problem is the infinite mode never connects the finite to the infinite through any causal connection. So essentially the monism turns into a dualism, separated by the void of the infinite mode.
And so we create the dyad of the one versus the many?
Yeah. And if you want, we can just read it, or at least the last little bit here. This is on 120. Spinoza undertook the ontological eradication of the void by the appropriate means of an absolute unity of the situation of presentation and the state of the representation, and I will designate as natural or ordinal multiplicities those that incarnate in a given situation the maximum in this equilibrium of belonging and inclusion. These natural multiples are those whose terms are all normal, which is to say, represented in the very place of their representation. According to this definition, every term for Spinoza is natural, i.e., everything is represented, everything is represented. In his famous Deus Civis Natria, is entirely founded. But the rule for this foundation hits a snag. The necessity of having to convoke a void term whose name, without a testifiable referent, i.e. infinite mode, inscribes errancy into the deductive chain. The great lesson of Spinoza is, in the end, the following. Even if, via the position of the supreme count as one, which fuses the state of the situation and the situation, that is, the metastructure and the structure, or inclusion and belonging, you attempt to annul the excess and reduce it to a unity of the presentative axis, you will not be able to avoid the errancy of the void. You will have to place its name. And of course, the name of that void for Spinoza is, again, as mentioned, infinite mode. So this is the failure of Spinoza, is he doesn't get rid of the void. It just forces its way out through regaining. So, any additional questions on Spinoza? Any other topics about this reading that you feel were not addressed?
No, I'm good for now.
All right, well, I propose that we break for lunch.